Very welcome everyone, and especially the fellows who finally arrived here. So this is the starting event of a Lias gathering, Lias, the Leuven Institute of Advanced Study. What we try to do is to bring some attention to topics, social topics that are of importance. And so we invite fellows from international fellows to discuss this theme. And so this is the first meeting. And the theme we will discuss in the coming days, the coming weeks, is reporting and artificial intelligence. As you know, there is a lot to do about artificial intelligence. People are a little bit afraid of it, or people are expecting a lot of it. And it's quite unsure how we need to handle it. It needs to be regulated, but it is not quite sure how. But of course, it depends a little on what you are applying artificial intelligence. And nowadays, it's also used in journalism and in the issue about reporting. With reporting, we mean more than just journalistic information. It's also the way people inform themselves about their society. They use all kinds of social media. They have information by discussions and these kinds of things. And that's also the source how they inform themselves about what happens in society. So the discussion will be about how can we think about artificial intelligence and how people become aware of what happens in their society. So the first issue is to think about why do we need reporting? Why do we need information? Why is it important that we are engaged in our society with journalistic information? And so before we discuss artificial intelligence, we first need to know what is the public function of reporting. If we have a better understanding of this kind of public function, then of course we can know how we can make use of artificial intelligence to improve that kind of function, or it's also possible that it will be of such a kind that it will go against the function of reporting. So the issue today is to discuss what reporting is about. Why do we as a society need journalistic engagement? Why do we need reporting? Why do we need to know what happens in our society? Now, most often when people are dealing with information, with journalism, they have often a kind of singularistic idea about it. It is about how an individual tries to inform himself or herself about what happens in society. And also when people are thinking about the problems people can have by being confronted with journalistic news or by information, it's often about what they can experience, how they, what the influences of reporting is on their well-being, on their way they like or dislike their body, how they think about others. The issue about polarization is, of course, something that is very important nowadays. But all these kinds of things are focusing on what happens really with the individual. Now, in our approach, and that's also something we will discuss together, there is also the possibility to think about the influence on reporting on how we think together as a kind of unit, as a kind of engaged group. Because if people inform themselves, it's not just because they are interested in particular things for private reasons. Most often when we turn on the radio or when we read a newspaper or try to fill in what happens in society, it's also our intention to know what is known. We want to be aware of what others are aware of about. And so journalism and reporting is about being aware of what we as a public are busy with. And that's a quite important issue. So it's more than just being individually informed, privately interested in particular things. It has also something to do with being aware of what others are being aware. Now, of course, the most magnificent example of such a kind of approach is, of course, following football. And nowadays, with the World Cup, if you look to the football match and you know that everyone is looking at the same time, it gets some magic, isn't it? It is as if you're engaged, you're participating in a bigger whole, and that gives some feeling of, I'm just not an isolated individual, I'm part of something bigger. So that has something to do with journalism because it creates a kind of attention, a joint attention, a common understanding of things. Now, this kind of element, it seems to be of importance. Why? Well, if we try to discuss things, or if we are engaged together as a society, it's quite important to know from each other what we know together. You need some common ground to make decisions, and you need to have a kind of an awareness of what is from that kind of common perspective is accepted, or is acknowledged, or is expected. So if we work together in small groups, the kind of coordination of our interactions is done by a common perspective. It's because I know that you know that I know that we as a we will do this or that, and it's from that kind of common perspective that you can coordinate your interactions. If you make an agreement, it's not just you as an individual who is making it, you make it together, and you know from that moment when that agreement is made, what is expected from each other, from a kind of common perspective. So if in a society there is a strong common awareness of what is happening, that creates a kind of awareness of what is expected for us as a society towards, for instance, what is agreed upon on a political level, of what is agreed upon the things we need to respect to deal with the issues that are of public importance. Now, this kind of joint intentionality, this kind of atmosphere that can be created within a society, it can be cultivated in different ways. It's sometimes interesting for journalists, commercially interesting, to create a kind of we are right, they are wrong mentality. The sphere of we are the strongest, most powerful, we don't need to listen to others, and we have a strong idea of what seems to be of importance. And we, as a we, can then make a distinction between who belongs and who is not belonging to, and we make a kind of sharp distinction between us and the others, a kind of group, in-group, out-group polarization. And often that creates a lot of sentiment and emotion, and that engaged people, so they feel indeed that kind of transcendent moment, but at the same time it can be very dangerous, because it creates not a kind of nuanced way of dealing with issues that are of societal importance. You can have, of course, a completely different kind of mentality. Instead of trying to confirm what you agreed upon as a unity, it can also the possibility to engage with information that makes what you think together less plausible, so that you need to rethink it and to create new perspectives to make the common perspective better. So an information that creates critical potentiality to improve what you as a group can do. And so journalism can function in both directions. It can be partially defend, we are right, they are wrong, or it can be quite nuanced. So if we have a better understanding of the real task of journalism in that kind of domain, how it can create a kind of common mentality within a society, a kind of atmosphere that is sufficient critical, that starts with a common ground founded on facts and not just on fantasy, that is about open to other kinds of societies, that finds a middle ground to deal with all the kind of people and respect them as human persons, then you have, of course, a completely different kind of mentality than if you choose for a more partial, we are right, they are wrong mentality. So this seems to be the issue. If we can define the task of journalism, the task of reporting, and we have a good definition of what that kind of public task is, then of course we can think about how artificial intelligence can be used, can improve this kind of critical way of common awareness, or it can also show that we are, it can create a more polarized way of dealing with things. So that's the issue. So we invited two important journalists and a former journalist who later became diplomat. They will discuss about the public task of journalism. And then, of course, the fellows are invited to ask questions, and everyone is invited to ask questions, so that we have a sharper focus on what journalism and reporting is about. To introduce people, I suppose journalists doesn't need to be introduced because they are already so well known, because they are public figures. So we have Rik Van Cauwelaert. He started as a sport journalist, but then moved to political reporting, was important in the magazine Nek, and now he has still a column in the Tijd. Then we have Bert De Vroey, who is already engaged from 1988 with the VRT, the toenmalige BRT. He is, of course, also engaged in the journalistic news, especially United States, foreign, so he makes programs then. And then the panel leader is Axel Buyse. Axel also was 11 years or 13 years? 20 years even. So the journalist for the Standard, one of the quality newspapers of our Flemish community, and then later went to diplomacy. He was the representative for the Netherlands, and then later also at the European community. I give Axel the floor.
Kindly invite you to take a seat. And perhaps we can start with some drinks, fortunately water at this moment. What would you like to have?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. Yeah. And for you, also sparkling?
Sparkling. Thank you.
So, let's start. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear fellows, this is a reflection on the public functioning of journalism, of reporting. So, could both of you start with giving an overview of what is, according to you, the public functioning of journalism?
Oh, he's on a public station.
Yeah, public.
Yeah, that's right. I work for.
I work for the public broadcaster VRT, which is the Flemish public broadcasters. For those of you who are from other countries who just arrived, as I've just heard, as you know, Belgium has three linguistic communities, cultural communities, and of course also a public broadcaster plays, I think, an important role in also creating or maintaining that cultural space and that cultural community. That's perhaps another thing that we can expand on later on. For me, I think reporting in general, but specifically public reporting or reporting by public media, like public broadcasters like the VRT, we tend to speak about two kinds of items or two kinds of stories that we bring. The nice to knows and the need to knows. I'm sure that you will be familiar, or many of you will be familiar with those terms. The nice to knows are stories that meet people's curiosity. Or like Bart was just explaining, now there's the World Championship of football going on, so everybody wants to be able more or less to discuss latest games that were played yesterday. For instance, when you meet your colleagues at a coffee machine, you want to keep up with what's happening in the world, even if you're not really interested in football. Or perhaps, to give another example, there is a big accident somewhere in Ghent, but you're living in Leuven, so it doesn't affect you actually, but a big accident, many cars involved, many people perhaps injured. So that's kind of, it meets curiosity and perhaps sometimes also a kind of sensationalist curiosity, but frankly it's not important whether you know it, whether you're informed about the accident or about the football game, or perhaps about the death of a pop star yesterday. It's not that important, but it's nice to know, and like Bart was already saying, it enables you to keep up with what's happening and to discuss these issues, these stories with colleagues or friends or family, whatever. And then you have the need to knows. And those are stories that are sometimes very boring and sometimes very not sensational at all, but they're important for people to help them understand what's happening in the world. One of the perhaps more recent examples is this week there was a lot to do about the budget deficit. Now I'm not sure if you would address people in the supermarket and you would ask them what do you think about the budget deficit, that they would start with giving their really a kind of opinion that's really, I mean they wouldn't be too much engaged about it, I guess. And so you have, or climate change, but those are things that may be important at one point in time. They could become very important for people to understand what's happening in the world, what's happening in their country, what's happening even, or let's say for instance, energy prices or energy trade. At first you might think that it's not very important for people until it affects the prices that they have to pay for energy. So I guess you understand what I mean. You have the nice to knows and you have the need to knows. And I think when it comes to public reporting or the importance of public reporting, and especially the mission, or if that's perhaps a big word, but the assignment, what's expected of public media, is that they at least don't give up on informing people about the need to knows, even if it's boring, even if it's not that easy to attract people to keep listening, to keep viewing television or reading stories. And I think any media, not only public media, but media that are practicing journalism in a proper and responsible way, will try to a certain degree to also cover the need to know stories. But you can't expect commercial media. They're entitled, they're free actually not to do that, I think. Because they have to take into account, well, advertising incomes, so what their readers or what their listeners or what their viewers are really interested in. And if it turns out that the budget deficit is not that kind of sexy subject that people want to know more about, then they will not keep listening or watching television. And so I think that's a big difference. And that's the big problem also for public media, because on the one hand, politicians expect public media to reach an audience which is big enough and important enough to motivate the funding of the public media, because it's usually done with public funding. And on the other hand, they have to do things that are not that attractive always for people, for an audience. And I think that's the big problem for public media, and that's also the problem and the challenge of public reporting in general.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Well,
we will repeat some of the issues you already told us, but Rik.
well, if you're talking about public function of reporting, the first thing is credibility. The credibility of the reporting. That's the main, for me, it's the main issue.
Mm-hmm.
And the man who said it best was, I'm going to quote him, and more than 3/4 of a century ago. It's George Orwell in Politics and the English Language. Ooh. And he says, a man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure, and then fail all the more completely because he drinks. It's rather the same thing that is happening to the English language. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish. But the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. Well, instead of the English language, Orwell could have spoken or written about reporting, about the quality and the public function of good reporting, and the quality of the exact wording in reporting. And the essay was immediately after his first publication in Horizon, the literary magazine, was circulated among journalists of the British Sunday newspaper, The Observer, by its owner, David Astor. And there you see already one difference between press bosses these days and the old ones. Because he gave it as a directive on good reporting. Only well-researched, well-written reporting has in my view, a public function. And if it doesn't matter if it's written for the newspaper, if it's done for the public broadcasting, or in a blog, because I think that we make too much of a difference of the arrival of artificial intelligence in this case, because the reporting, the essence of reporting stays the same. And carelessness in reporting, when I was at NAC and I was the editor, I always said it's like a woodworm. You only see the damage when it's too late. And when the carelessness sets in and the reporting gets sloppy and inaccurate, it loses the confidence of the consumer of the news. And we will talk about some cases, spectacular cases, where particularly the Flemish press lost its credibility in the past 20 years. And I've seen it happen too many times, even in so-called quality newspapers and quality news outlets. And the surviving of the media, as someone called them, they function as a social airbag. If they don't have that function anymore, if they lose their credibility, then it's the end of reporting. The essence is in reporting, and the public function is credibility.
Okay. Now, as long as there has been reporting, there was let's say, a serious variety of outlets, and this variety is even bigger nowadays than it was in the past. It brings me to the question if it is sufficient for the formation of, I would say, a healthy public opinion to have a set of quality newspapers and reliable reporting via a public broadcaster. But what about all the others outlets, the tabloids, the Twitter, the Facebooks of our time?
Yeah. Well, the phenomenon of the tabloid is new in the 19th century. You had the yellow press.
Yeah.
It was exactly the same way of working. But there's been a difference in the meantime. That is, I grew up with, my father was an Anglophile, incurable Anglophile. And he brought with him all the English newspapers, and among them was the Daily Mirror. Now the Daily Mirror was something like the household paper of the Labour Party at the time. But was a tabloid, with page 3 girls and a lot of sports. But it was a brilliant example of good reporting. It was a well-made newspaper. But nowadays you have, for instance, in England, you have the Sun, who's the mirror has nearly disappeared, and the sun is in the hands of Rupert Murdoch. Everybody knows the guy, and he said one thing he made one observation that was very right in making this observation. He said the sheep have taken over the herd by the new media. I mean, they are dictating what they want to know, and where they don't believe the mainstream press. I mean, it comes from the new media, the Twitters and so on, and Facebook, and the press bosses here have underestimated that phenomenon.
The press bosses themselves.
The press bosses themselves have underestimated, not so much the journalists as the press bosses, who wanted to keep their old their old terrain that they occupy. And I remember my boss at the time, Rik Van Cauwelaert, he thought that internet would be something, just transitory. Mm-hmm. It would go away after a while. If the new thing, if the newness of it disappeared, it would go away. He couldn't believe that it was something that would revolutionize the whole media business, and they couldn't adapt. Mm-hmm. It's only now that they start. I don't know how it worked at the VRT, but in the beginning, they didn't believe in it, and they didn't see what was going to happen. That what Murdoch said, that the sheep were going to take over. And also the journalists have underestimated that part of the game. That they let's for instance, these days, what do the politicians do? They take direct contact with their so-called electors with the new media. They go in contact immediately, in direct contact. Mm-hmm. They don't need the intermediary. Mm-hmm. And it's the use of that is made of the new media, because we certainly talk of Brexit. And it's not so much as that the information given by the new media, the wrongful information, the things that the Brexiteers are spreading, no. But they used the new media to mobilize about 3 million voters who never voted in their life. And the famous Dominic Cummings, or I should say infamous Cummings, that's what he did. And these 3 million, and he mobilized through the new media, were the guys that made a difference. It wasn't the well-educated against the non-educated, it wasn't the rich against the poor, or the people living in cities and people living in the country. No. It's these 3 million that he mobilized that made a difference. But that had nothing to do with reporting.
Yeah.
If you're talking about new media, it's not only the fact that we have now much more outlets than we used to have before the arrival of the internet. It's also the way people are getting across news is totally different, because and the way they can pick and choose their news, that's totally different. I think that's the main difference. It's not that they have that they have much more options for media outlets. It's the main difference is that and many people tend to really pick and choose their media, and usually, well, first of all, media that are focusing on subjects that they are themselves interested in. And perhaps there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if there would be a website about ducks and people like ducks, there have been magazines about ducks, that's not a problem. but they also pick and choose the media that represent a worldview, a way of looking at society that suits them. Like, and perhaps you could also say that also in earlier days, people picked and chose their newspaper. That's right, and some of them were more labor, but still, I think there's a big difference because, well, especially on the internet, that's the way people do it, and I think this also touches on the subject of artificial intelligence, because with the algorithms, of course, people are, this tendency to look for what you like, and what you like to read, and what you like, and people tend to look for opinions or analysis that confirm what they already think, and algorithms will reinforce that, as we all know. But I think that's the main difference. And I think for public media, it's important, yeah, of course, I think also VRT has been a bit late in adapting to the new context of the internet. I think currently we are I think of course we've added the internet site with articles, with news articles, which that in itself has created some tensions also with commercial media, with newspapers, because they said, what is VRT doing? All of a sudden they are publishing articles, text, that's something they never did, and that's another discussion. But I think it has become perhaps even the most important of the three. If you have radio, television, and internet, I think internet has become almost the most important also for VRT. But the thing that VRT should not only VRT, and by the way, I'm talking here in my personal name.
Sure. No problem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. But I think what public media can never do, or what they should never give into, is a kind of pressure to also work with the model of algorithms and offering people what they are looking for.
Yeah.
And then I come back to this nice to knows and need to knows, because public media are required to report on all the things that matter for people to understand society, even if it's the budget deficit, even if it's a discussion about confederalism. Now for the foreigners this doesn't mean anything, but we have a discussion. I'm not sure if it's a big discussion, but it's a discussion which is very important for some political parties, and even to the extent that they make the big issue for the next elections. Are we going to have confederalism in Belgium or not? Again, if you would address people in the supermarket, I doubt it that they would have a lot to say about it. Then our assignment, and all the media actually who would like to practice journalism in a responsible way, is to explain to people what is confederalism. How could it work? Are there any countries where we have seen working, where we have seen operating it in practice? And so, I mean, if public media, and VRT has already done that to a certain extent, but I think that's not a problem in itself. VRT has offered, for instance, the people who read the articles on the internet to opt for regional news. If you live in the province of West Vlaanderen, then you can opt for news from West Vlaanderen, Antwerp, Leuven, Brabant. I think there's nothing wrong with that, because
it's local news.
It's local news. So why not? But if public media would also offer the possibility to people, if you're visiting our site, you can opt for only news about, I don't know, fashion, only news about, and then the minute you open our site, the only articles you will see is about fashion, or the only articles is about sports. That would be a mistake, I think.
Yeah.
That would be forsaking to the assignment that you have as a public outlet, as a public media outlet. Because then you're not offering the people anymore. Even, of course, I know people are free to read the articles in a newspaper they like, and they won't read the articles they're not interested in, but at least they will see the titles. And the
Yeah.
same applies to an internet site, any internet site by any newspaper, but especially for public.
Well, I'm inclined to go a bit personal with you, if I may. You can refuse to answer. But I read a tweet from you saying that for the very first time in your career, you participated in a strike. Can you comment on that?
No.
No. But it had to do with the functioning.
But not with the functioning of the news in it.
Not of the news of itself.
So I think, no.
Yeah.
Of course there are some.
Internal problems. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
It's no, I'm not going to go into that.
Okay, fine. Fine.
I never strike.
You're an independent.
And by the way, it wasn't on Twitter.
Ah, it was on Facebook then. Yeah. Well, okay.
Only for friends.
Ah, no. Thanks anyway.
It wasn't public.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. Yeah. But Rik, you mentioned some moments when the Flemish press lost a lot of its credibility.
Yep.
Can you give an example and explain why, according to you, they missed or they lost their credibility by it?
Well, the print press. I'm speaking especially about the print press, but also about public broadcast. And I'll give an example of what can happen if the reporting gets sloppy. We had the famous De Vroey case.
Yeah, you too. Yeah.
Everybody knows what it is.
No.
It was a man who had four girls
abducted.
Kept them in his cellar, killed them. In fact, starved them to death. The whole thing exploded in the summer months. So that means there was no or nearly no other news, and everybody really jumped at it. Now it was a serious case, you know.
Some 20 years ago.
Yeah, but in the wake of
30
this case, you had what we call the X dossiers. And what were the X dossiers? Was there were some testimonials of people. In fact, there were 6 X's in all, and of people, mainly women, who said that they had been raped by and had been
Abused.
used by a group of pedophiles and
High-ranking
very
people.
well, high-powered people who were in these in this conspiration, let's say. And some of these girls, particularly one, what's his name again? Regina Louf, was interviewed by the VRT in a special program, Pano. Nothing of what she said was true. Nothing. It was a psychiatric case, the girl in question, which was dramatic enough. But it was sold as a true story. And if you want, you can still look at it at YouTube. It's still, the whole thing is still on YouTube with no comment from the public broadcast saying we were wrong here to do this. It's not been retired from YouTube. It's still there. And that was one of the cases where the Flemish press particularly lost its credibility. And one of the press bosses told me that because of the newspaper who really went after it was the Morgen. The whole dossier, it's nice to know when you have to make choices. The whole dossier with testimonials by the different exes was presented to NAC magazine at the time. by the policeman who did the interrogations. And when we read this, these are mental cases. We gave it back, and it popped up in the morgue. And from there on, it started developing, and it went on for months and months. They had a special inquiry commission in the parliament, where all these stories were repeated, but none of it was true. Nobody did serious, except magazine. Yeah, we did some serious reporting. We went to check out what's in the testimonials, and thought that in the timeline it was not possible what she was telling. But it went on for months, and the more, that's what I'm saying. The reader in the end knows that he's been duped. And they started losing spectacularly after that case. But I must say also the rest of the press that followed the dossier has lost a lot of its credibility. It's a spectacular case, and I hope it doesn't happen again.
Of course, that was a big mistake, and also on the part of the
VRT panorama, I think it was called that moment. And that was even before the arrival of the internet. But perhaps to excuse sometimes mistakes like that, and it shouldn't be an excuse, it's a mistake, and a mistake is a mistake, but to see what kind of context media are operating in right now, and with the internet even more, is that sometimes also in our newsroom, sometimes there is a story that we tend to say no, it's not serious, or some aspects of a story that are not really confirmed, so we're not going to mention it. For instance, take an example of there is an attack, especially during the last 10 years, that was very difficult many times. Often we've come across this kind of stories. There is an attack in the street on a policeman, or perhaps not on a policeman. Is it a terrorist attack or not? Oh, then there is a witness who tells a journalist of some medium, yeah, because the one who did it, the man who did it, shouted Allahu Akbar. But if it's not confirmed, we're not going to give it if we're not sure that it's a terrorist attack. Or sometimes we will mention it, but not describing it as a terrorist attack. It's unimaginable how many reactions you will get within hours on your internet site, on your internet platform, from people. Why aren't you mentioning it, that it's a terrorist attack and that the man has been shouting Allahu Akbar? What is VRT not wanting to tell the people? Why it's a conspiracy? You never want to say it when it's a terrorist attack. And Rik, I think you have to admit that this pressure has become much, much bigger than even during the 90s, when this mistake, and it's a serious mistake, it's an awful mistake, that the Regina Louf story. But the pressure that we now feel from the public in general, who can react instantaneously, and that's also a difference, because, okay, before the internet, people could write a letter to the newspaper, and if they were fortunate,
it was published.
Many of the letters were never published. But now every reaction is published on the platform. There is some moderation going on for most of the newspapers, but it takes a while before some things are removed, some reactions are removed. So it's a lot of insults, and so the pressure has become much bigger, and it shouldn't be like that. And I think especially public broadcaster, public medium should not give in to that kind of pressure.
Exactly.
And stand its ground and also other newspapers and magazines like Knack and many newspapers in Flanders. I think we're fortunate to have many good newspapers who will not give in too easily to that kind of pressure, but you cannot deny that this pressure has become much more important than it used to be 20 years ago, 30 years ago, especially with the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Because the things that you are not reporting on or that you are not mentioning in your reports are also important, have become much more important than 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Because people will see a kind of secret reasons why you are not mentioning it. Whereas the only reason is that you have no confirmation.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a big problem now.
Do you see any
Cure for this kind of conspiracy divulgation we are witnessing nowadays?
There will always be conspirationalists. They've always been there. So it's in continuing and not giving in to the pressure. That's important. We had another case. You remember the case of Joe van Olsbeek? Yes, the young man who was killed at Central Station in Brussels, stabbed to death by two other youngsters. And immediately there was a police report saying that they had a dark complexion.
Yeah, North African or yeah.
Being well, they didn't use the word North African.
Yeah.
They just mentioned the dark complexion. Yeah. Immediately, I remember that it happened just before Easter, and we with Knack, normally we printed on Monday, but because of Easter, we suddenly had to print on Friday, and it happened on the Thursday before Easter, and there was on the radio, in the papers, immediately big discussions, debates on what are we, in what world are we living. There was one guy who said, "Give us weapons to defend us against these North African youngsters who are killing our white boys." And I remember that I got a phone call from the publisher, the owner of the news magazine, and he said, "Why are you not covering on this case?" I said, "Because we don't know who did it." Mm-hmm. Luckily, because it was not two North Africans, it was two Polish youngsters. But there was within some of the papers, and I think I remember a discussion on the VRT also with the famous Professor Vermeers, who also was scandalized by what was happening. But nobody knew exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to keep away from that pressure at that moment. It's very difficult.
And there's another thing also that on Monday you
can decide within your newsroom, you're not going to report on it because it's not, you don't have confirmation or it's not very. On Tuesday, a political discussion
emerges,
even in the Belgian Parliament, and on Wednesday, you can't escape from it. You have to report on it.
Yeah. And
that's also a lesson that we've learned, of course, because even if the political discussion is about nothing, which and I can't give you an example now, but it has happened that it's all a big fake story, or perhaps not really a fake story, but that the controversy in itself is actually a fake controversy, and it goes away like that. But between Monday and Wednesday, there is an enormous pressure to report on it. And then it's very difficult to stand your ground and say, no, we're not going to do that because we don't think it's confirmed, first of all, or we don't know all the details, we don't know the circumstances. So what are we going to say about it? That's
yeah.
problem.
Do you see a clear connection between what is called populism nowadays and the way some outlets are reporting in Flanders?
Not immediately. I mean, what could be called the populist papers.
Yeah.
Let's take, for instance, there's two of them that the most popular papers are the Nieuwsblad and the Livestream.
Yeah.
And in the French-speaking part, you have La Dernière Heure.
Mm-hmm.
Are they influential? Certainly. Because you see that politicians, for instance, like in England, I mean, they may be conservative or Labour, but they will take care of their relations with the Sun. If they don't have the support of the Sun, it will be very difficult to end up in Downing Street 10. And here you see the same thing. You see, for instance, a man like Bert De Vroey, of the Flemish nationalist, who has a very good connection with the last news. I mean, you feel it. I'm not saying that the comments by these people, by my colleague from the last news, are influenced by that, but you see that he's very keen on a good relation with last news. So you see it everywhere in Europe. You see it also in France. In Germany, I mean, in Germany it would be very difficult if you get to be prime minister or councillor if you get built against you. So you feel that that's nothing to do with populism. It's by the reach that they have. It's much bigger than Der Spiegel, for instance. And in England, for instance, you have all the quality papers, The Guardian, Financial Times, they were against Brexit. They didn't. Their influence on the public opinion was nearly nil. So, of course, there is a link between the populism and the popular press. But now, honestly, there's a lot of, like for instance, the last news, who are very critical of the Flemish line. You can't say that they are not critical. No, they are. But in the mainstream public opinion, they are playing quite a bigger role than, for instance, the Standard or Nacht magazine. I think the VRT has a lot of influence on public opinion.
I don't know if we still have a lot of influence on public opinion. Perhaps one side aspect, but I was mentioning it earlier, the VRT of course, but not only the VRT, the Flemish media, also the VTM is the big commercial television that we have since. Actually it's interesting because it's about creating this cultural common space. Up to the end of the 80s, people in Flanders tended to watch the Dutch television a lot, television in the Netherlands, much more than they do now. Why? Because there was only VRT was called by then, in that time, and it was sometimes a bit dull. It wasn't always very exciting television, and in the Netherlands you had a much broader array of programs and also shows and things like that. So people watched, but it also meant, in my opinion, in my view, as a child I watched a lot of Dutch television, that we felt closer to the Dutch. And this Flemish community has become much more, in a way you could almost say provincial, within itself, since VTM has arrived. And I'm not criticizing VTM, that's not what I intend to do.
It was not their intention, of course.
Analyzing what has happened. And I mean, broadcasters, television especially, but now television is becoming less and less important, but for decades, for a few decades, television has really created, and radio, have created a common space, a cultural common space. And with VTM, the tendency of Flemish people also to look over the border and to watch Dutch television has decreased, and people have because they have an alternative, alternative in VTM. And so now, but that's not good. So VTM, and that's why I'm telling this and I'm saying this because I think not only VRT has a lot of influence, probably we have, but also VTM. I think you should take both together. And there are some minor commercial, well not minor perhaps in terms of market share, but there are some other commercial stations that don't offer that many news programs. So if it's about news or reporting, then we talk about VRT and VTM. And together they have a lot of influence. I'm sure they do.
They're doing something very special since the year or two. The Last News and VTM is owned by the same group. So now you see that, for instance, the newsroom of the Last News and the newsroom of VTM is not only in the same building, it's on the same floor. And when a story is developing, they're working together so that they push the story that's going to come into the Last News. They push it in VTM, so it becomes the big story of the group. And they have a particular system of working, which is also used in the English press. I mean, they have 4 editors per day. There's an editor that starts in the morning, and he makes a paper as if he's published, as if it's published on midday, and then there's another who comes on midday, and he makes it as if it comes out at 4 o'clock, and so until the evening. And the man, the last man, is the most important man. But all the time you have this collaboration between VTM and so, because VTM has a news at 1 o'clock, and there's really a very close.
But I also
collaboration between them.
And I think that limits also, you were saying that Het Laatste Nieuws is a populist, more or less populist newspaper, but I think this model of working together with VTM News, television news, limits, plus all and radio outlets, and it limits the degree, the extent to which the Het Laatste Nieuws will be a really populist newspaper. Because even the Het Laatste Nieuws,
you cannot compare,
to report on also the need to knows. Even if it's difficult, they will try to do so. If they were really only concerned about selling newspapers or getting clickbaits, they wouldn't keep doing what they are doing. And VTM News is actually very good news. I mean, I'm not saying that our television news is much better than sometimes there will definitely be days that VTM News, even in my opinion, in my judgment, will be better than what we offer that same day. So VTM is doing a very good job.
But they have an advantage there that they have regional news.
They have a network.
National news.
Because
they're very close in monitoring what's happening regionally, and they have immediately teams of their own reporters that
the whole network.
They have a story that's developing in Ghent or in Veurne, and they think that could be a national interest. There's immediately 1 or 2 reporters who leave and go and take over the story.
So there is no, I would say, there is not a real problem between a commercial approach of media and its public function. Also commercial media can completely function as they should do.
Yes, but you in theory and also in Flanders, fortunately in practice, it works like that. But you can't be sure that all commercial media will keep working like that. I mean, they have to also generate sufficient income to and I think that's because you were the editor-in-chief of Knack, but Knack is also it's a very good magazine, very good journalism, but a very small niche of the Flemish
It's about
population.
About 100,000.
100,000, yeah, but I mean, if you would look at the sociological characteristics of the readers of Knack, it would be a very limited group of people that are reading it.
Highbrow.
Socially, it's the same group. Socially.
The same group
The
as?
same, it's the people who are reading it are in the same group.
Oh yeah,
Socially.
yeah.
And that's a difference. They never go after 200,000 like a UMO did. They weren't interested
Mm-hmm.
in these because what their advertising did
Mm-hmm.
on the site, and there was what NAC, because we talk about that, there was a Chinese wall between the commercial service and NAC magazine. But their advertisers weren't interested in more. They just wanted this group, particular group. I mean,
It focused on it.
for instance, the Financial Times isn't interested in becoming or having a readership like
The Sun.
the Sun,
Yeah.
because they can't afford the products that are advertised
Yeah.
in the Financial Times.
It's clear. Yeah. Okay. Perhaps we should turn to the public. I don't know if you have any questions or observations you made up during.
Yes, good evening. My name is Joost van Leeuwen. Together with Mark Valtijn, the co-chair of Lias, Livestream for Advanced Studies. I'm happy to be your host, and I thank you for the very interesting talk that you gave. My question is the following. I fully agree with Mr. De Vroey that the public media, so I'm going to repeat my question. I fully agree with Mr. De Vroey that the role of the public media is to inform the public about the need to knows, even if they're a bit boring, like confederalism or budget deficit. And on the other hand, I fully agree with Mr. Van Cauwelaert that quality reporting, quality media needs to be eloquently worded on the one hand and well researched. Now there's where my question comes from. Language zone, een kleine taalgebied. So logically, consequently, our readership or our kijkerschap is limited. Our professional status is limited, so we can't have the research qualities of, for example, Anglo-Saxon media outlets where the readership or the public is much bigger and the professional status is much bigger. Even if our journalists would be twice as good as their counterparts there, the outlets could never do the same quality research. My question, very logically, as we're here in Leuven and we're at Lias, is there a role for the universities and the academic institutions that we have, which are of top quality, is there a role there to cooperate with the media to make the quality of the media better?
Well, I think that in some cases it's already being done. When I was at NAC magazine, for instance, if it was on the scientific level, we had a very good relationship with this university, but also with Ghent and so on. But there you touch a delicate question, in fact, because we are talking here about media as the drivers of public opinion. I think you tend to forget that also you at the university have a role to play. For instance, we talked about the Dutroux case, which was a very dangerous moment politically.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear a voice from the university saying, hey, be careful here.
No, on the contrary.
On the contrary. We had some voices who were, I will not say populistic, but it resembles it. So, which in fact happened in France, because in France they had a similar case, smaller than the Dutroux case, and suddenly, seeing what was happening in Belgium, in the press they also tried to develop the same drive against the great hunt for pedophiles amongst high-powered people. And there suddenly you saw people from the Parisian universities who said, hey, stop it.
Calm down.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I didn't hear that here from. And honestly, I was a bit disappointed at the time. Especially if you're in a magazine like ours, and there was the Standard also tried to put the brakes on the whole thing, but that you aren't supported in doing that. But that's a bit apart from what you're.
Well, I think it's also about the need to know about the complex topics. There was, for example, that's a rather personal opinion, but in COVID times, I think the academic world could have done much more also, and also from a multidisciplinary point of view, not only with experts, medical or virologists or hospital experts, but also from the psychological and economic side. So I find there is certainly from the multidisciplinary academic world viewpoint, there is too less input into the media to support the more complex, the more need-to-know topics.
I mean, we have academics every night.
Yeah. If I may, just one other, perhaps a kind of practical advice. Don't start a journal. We have many journalism schools now in Belgium, in Flanders.
Several.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite recent development. But I would say don't start a journalism school on a bachelor level. Because what I've seen is that people doing journalism school only on a bachelor level, or immediately starting, what are you going to study? I'm going to start journalism, and you're 18 years old, and you haven't studied anything else. You tend to learn skills.
Yeah.
How to work with computer, how to do editing of television, video editing, and things like that. But my experience is that it's much richer also for a newsroom to have journalists with different backgrounds, different academic backgrounds.
Yeah.
Even perhaps some people who don't have an academic background, but who have a specific other kind of background, and perhaps do some journalism school after you have studied something else. It's much richer for a newsroom, and it's kind of, sometimes I think it's kind of empty schooling, journalism schools. Not all of them, there are some good journalism trainings or programs in Flanders, but I've seen it happening. So that's one practical advice.
Yeah. I saw two questions and then a third one, but you were the first man. First and then the second and then the third.
Thanks a lot for what you were saying. I had three points out of here, but I'm worried about some of the attribution. I mean, I really appreciate hearing from people who all have experience from before the internet, but everyone who's sort of been active since 1945 has been active in a period when we've had, well, actually since 1978 mostly, increasing inequality, wealth inequality, and increasing political polarization. But it's not that predated social media, and also we had it in the late 19th century too. So we've had these kind of fluxes here. So I was really curious about, and also a random piece. Andy Guess, he's a professor at Princeton, did a big study of all this about were people really using the news streams to only read the things, particular views. It turned out that they said that they were reading the thing that went along with their identity, but if you looked at what they were looking at their computer, and he got permission from 2,000 people to see what they're actually clicking on, they were almost all, there was a few very far out on the right wing, but almost all of them were actually reading the centrist news, similar to what Bart was saying. They all wanted to know what was really going on. So what they reported watching was was their identity signaling, but what they actually read was actually much more middle of the road. So I was wondering, actually, now, and especially because of this conversation, that's why I took in the jump in. As a member of the academia who is in the news some amount of time, more than some academics, it's not easy to get there. I have no idea how to get myself into it. Actually, right now I do have a Wired editor, but until this year, I had no way of getting an article out when I wanted to, even when I tried really hard. It was just that randomly, sometimes they called me, right? However, at least I'm on Twitter. And so now people, a lot of journalists follow me, and whether or not they credit me, some do, some don't, you know that you're influencing them and they're having impact. So I'm wondering if it would have been harder now to have some of these runaway weird stories, because the people who did want to know knew that there were sources they could go to directly, bypassing the main media, and go into these kinds of sources. So we know that there's some people that we wish that they didn't pay attention to. And I'm sorry, I've already made this too long a question. But if I had more time, I'd be talking about like Fox News and Murdoch and some of those kinds of directions that things have gone, which you mentioned a little. But I'm just reflecting back on your experience. Do you feel like those real cesspools that lasted for months, couldn't they have been punctured if it was a contemporary time with more different news sources?
You've recently seen what's happening at Twitter. You've seen what Musk trying to intervene.
That's really interesting too, because I'm terrified of what Musk is doing, and I'm saying, oh, we should nationalize Twitter. It's essential infrastructure. But at the same time, the truth is that I haven't seen a massive difference in what
the thing is
what's
that
happening.
Twitter won't survive for a month if he doesn't have the mainstream media who are, feeding Twitter every day with their news stories. I mean, I'm using Twitter to get immediate access in real time to some news stories that are developing in Ukraine or in London or in Paris. A lot of people do that because of that. And then you have the surroundings, I mean, the nameless Twitterers who are giving commentaries. And you have also, unfortunately, some organizations who think they have a journalistic role to play and who are picking mainly on the mainstream media, saying, well, why aren't you bringing this story, and then they bring in a fake newsreel or a photo. And I mean, if you need a whole staff to contradict them. So it's not. I mean, I don't say that you have to do it, but if you want to do that, you have, and to puncture that, you need a whole staff to do that, and it's not feasible. And in the end, all these stories, these fake stories, in the end, they always implode.
Yeah.
They take imploding.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's because the quality, I mean, vindicates all that. Finally, it takes some while, it takes a time, but it happens.
Yeah. Madam.
Thank you for the discussion so far. I would like to go back a bit to the beginning of the first question that you asked about what was the role of the public role of reporting, and one of you referred to credibility, but also to this need to know. And my question is about perspective. You cannot report without taking a specific stance or perspective. You talked about football. If you watch, and probably in a couple of days there will be a Dutch-Belgium football game, maybe, I don't know, but might happen. If you watch it here in Belgium, you will see it taped from one side of the stadium. If you see it in the Netherlands, you will see it taped from the other side of the stadium. So the perspectives are different. And when you see people running to the left in the Netherlands, you see them running to the right. It's how they do it. It's because of commercial things, because they can put all the Dutch advertisements in one side of the stadium and all the Belgian advertisements on the other side of the stadium. But this happens all the time. So it's very important to be, when you need to be credible and when you need to put the need to know, to be transparent about what is your perspective. Another example, I come from Portugal. In the 70s, Portugal was in a war with their, at the time, colonies. The Portuguese news were full of stories of terrorists. Here in the rest of Europe, they were calling them, rightly so, freedom fighters. Again, a question of perspective. So how can you conjugate credibility and need to know without being transparent? Or it's even more than transparent, because you need to understand that you are taking a specific perspective in whatever you are reporting. It's never kind of valueless. You always take a side.
I'm an ancient sport journalist, and I left it because it became pure infotainment. It's pure infotainment. They had a case at the VRT with a journalist. Was he a journalist, or was he belonging to the entertainment section? Huh?
That's right.
And so this is entertainment. I mean, what we're seeing now is entertainment, and nothing to do.
Still, but you
with
see a different left side of the entertainment here, and you see the right side or the other side of the stadium in the Netherlands. So even in the entertainment, you have a perspective in which you are telling the same.
It's normal that if you're reporting for Dutchmen, that you report on the Dutch side of the story of the World Cup, as you do for the Belgians or the French. But the way it's treated these days, the whole of sports is a entertainment business. Just
The question is a bit broader than.
Than sports.
when you think immediately what it is.
But
Forget sport and take the Portuguese terrorists against the freedom fighters. Pure question of perspective, and we have to be
yes, but that's a tricky one. And we have no, but especially I'm not going to talk about the 70s and in Portugal and the freedom fighters, or of course it's well known that also in South Africa and probably in Angola, and people we used to call terrorists later became freedom fighters, and now we have a colonial guilt, and I mean it has changed, developed during time. But let's not go that far back. But for instance, talk about well, to mention a tricky one, let's talk about Israel and Palestine, and talk about terrorist attacks on the West Bank against Israeli soldiers. Do we have to call them terrorists, or are they people of resistance? Because they are okay, no, I understand, and this is for example, an example that's real and that's difficult. Now, more generally speaking, I do think that you should be able, if you talk about the budget deficit, or if you talk about immigration, it's a very tense issue. You shouldn't start from a certain perspective, whether you like migration or not. You should be able to report on the advantages of immigration. We have an aging population, so we're going to need migrants perhaps in a few generations from now. But there are some difficulties, social difficulties, cultural difficulties. We have a lot of problems or questions to solve. What are we doing with different cultures and different cultures? So you shouldn't be, I don't think you should tell your audience what your perspective on migration. You should try to report on the advantages and the disadvantages and the real problems that immigration will bring. But that doesn't mean that, for instance, you have to be, in all cases, and specifically if you are reporting on politics, I don't think that you should be neutral in the sense that you should give an equal amount of space or time to different positions. For instance, if you talk about Trump, who has lost the elections, you shouldn't keep repeating to the audience every time you report about Trump, Trump who has lost the elections, but who himself says that he didn't lose the election. No, you shouldn't do that, because 60 judges have judged that Trump has lost the election. I mean, where does it end if you are going to start questioning all the things that there is a kind of consensus about? And that's sometimes people expect us to do that. You don't mention that it's still not decided, it's still undecided who has won and who has lost the American election. No, but people, they keep doing that. They keep telling us that we should always mention, but perhaps Biden, who has claimed victory, but we don't know yet if he has really. No, but I mean, or it's an even more important issue, perhaps COVID. There are many people who don't want us to say that COVID has been a real problem or a real unknown disease that has been killing people. No, it's just something like the flu. And if we, so I mean, really perhaps take a perspective. You have to explain it explicitly to the people. We are among the media that accept COVID to be a real problem. I mean, no.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't want to make fun of what you're saying. I'm just saying that there is sometimes a kind of perspective that we will take from a broad consensus that's predominant in the society, in the cultural space where we work in. But you shouldn't be, and I think you should, but on many controversial issues, you should try to how do you say this, to mention and to report on advantages, disadvantages, problems, and so on. But not always. Neutrality doesn't mean that you have to be.
There's a difference between being neutral and unbiased.
Yeah.
It's a big difference.
That's
It's a big difference.
Yeah.
And for instance, I worked for Associated Press a long time ago, and these agencies, for instance, you couldn't use adjectives. No, you couldn't use them. You must have had to be as clear as possible in the use of your language. In fact, it's a bit what Orwell, that I was quoting in the beginning, is saying. You could be perfectly unbiased without being extremely neutral. It's like if like Trump, for instance, if someone comes to you and says he's Napoleon, do you have to accept his opinion or not? That's what Trump is doing.
Yeah, that's
exactly
right.
what Trump
That's
is
right. That's right. Okay, gentlemen. Professor Fatine?
I wanted to intervene too. I think we need to be careful as academics to distrust being truthful. If we go too much in that direction, we will have a problem with credibility. So a philosopher I very like is William, Truth and Truthfulness, Bernard Williams, of course. Bernard Williams, and he wrote a book, Truth and Truthfulness, because he was afraid of the academics coming up with the idea that there is no possibility to reach the truth and there is no partial, and he came up with a clear definition of how we indeed can and do our best to do it as good as possible, to be accurate and to be sincere, following the methods that are applicable to the question we are dealing with. And so impartiality is a possibility to reach if at least we try to figure out how things would be represented to a universal audience, where we try to explain it in such a way that a universal audience could understand the particularity of what really happened. And that kind of position is something like Thucydides has already developed. At least it's never perfect, but it's not because it's not completely reachable that we would give up it. In any case, sorry. There was the question there too.
Question somewhere there, the lady. Oh yeah. And there was the first question here. Okay.
You decide.
I would say the lady first. And then the gentleman. Sorry for that, but It's a bit difficult to look because of the lights. So take your call.
Okay, thank you. Mostly these days, the journals, paper journals, are in the hands of two media houses. It's DPG and Media House. So in what way is this monopolizing our information, and is it going to be better or worse? So what are the dangers of these monopolies? It's also in Holland. I mean, all Dutch papers. I talk about Belgian papers, Dutch papers, and Holland papers.
It could be a problem. It could be a problem if one of these bosses or the two bosses were modeling themselves on Murdoch. That could be a problem. But fortunately, it's not the case. So far, these groups are given the utmost freedom to their reporters. I've never felt at the Standard or at the Laatste Nieuws even, although it's been said, but it's never been proven, that the media bosses intervened in the work of the journalists. So far we're lucky. But it's something to keep an eye on. And the first who should do that are the reporters themselves.
So in the introduction it was suggested that one of the tasks of the press or the media more generally is to create a sense of community, and then preferably a more or less harmonious community. I mean, is that really a role of the press? Can the press, no, I'm talking about the introduction. Is that really a role of the press? Is that something the press can do? You talked about public opinion. I mean, that may be something that the press can contribute to, but do we still have a public opinion? We have a diversity of opinion amongst the population, but I wouldn't know. And on some topics there's probably a majority opinion, but is there really such a thing as a public opinion? And can we expect from the press that they would contribute to sort of harmony in society?
Well, in many cases, wherever we are, we have an idea of what seems to be expected from us. So there is always a kind of idea of what would be a transgression and what would be allowed. So people have a kind of sense of what seems to be appropriate within the kind of context they are moving. And that's, so it's formed by the idea of what one is thinking in such moments. And I suppose that everywhere we are, we have such a kind of idea. So for instance, you are answering all kinds of expectations, not just first of all by asking everyone what should I do, but because you have a sense of what seems to be appropriate or not. So there is a kind of sense of how one is thinking within a society and what one is expecting from you. And so people seem to have a kind of an idea of what one is thinking within the society. So the public opinion seems to be, we think what there is thought. And the result of that is not just because I know exactly, because I know everyone's opinion, but because what has been made public. So I have for instance, if there is in the press constantly news about the fact that people hate the regulations about COVID, they will have the idea that indeed public opinion is against it. So that seems to be a quite natural affinity, even if that is wrong, because most people are positive about these kinds of regulations. They can be mistaken because of the kind of impression they've got because of the mass media. And I don't think you can escape the fact that people have an idea of what they think one is thinking. The quality can be bad, they can be completely mistaken, but we have that kind of notion, always, wherever we are. So that would be my answer. I'm not quite sure if that...
There is not something like a public opinion. There might be a moment of consensus of something. For instance, Russia invades Ukraine and everybody's scandalized. But when you look now at the public opinion in Europe, there are questions being asked by people saying, are we going to keep up with our support for Ukraine? Because this is costing us. You see, there you feel that public opinion is changing. But I never had the feeling, and I don't think Bert neither, that he was feeding public opinion. He was trying to do his job, and I'm also trying to do my job as correctly and as unbiased as possible, informing people correctly. And that it doesn't go farther than that. The public opinion forms, it's something that moves on.
I have the idea that it is becoming very dry here. So perhaps we should stop here and have a drink, unless...
The lady there has...
Oh, the lady, sorry. Right.
Sorry for some extra time, but two quick questions that bridge what we discussed today, what is reporting and the public role of reporting, to our artificial intelligence story perhaps. So if I understand correctly, one of the big challenges for professional media, because we were discussing reporting by professional media, one of the big challenges is to sort out what is true or truthful and what is fake news. Do you see a role for AI tools to help you with that, to verify news? Are you already using that in the newsrooms? And a second quick question is, we haven't really been discussing the role of reporting by non-professional media, and in the introduction by Bart, it was said that there's a lot of competition in terms of attention, eyeballs taken away by the social media. And also the Digimeter, the study of the University of Ghent, shows that youngsters are informed through social media rather than newspapers and watching VTM or VRT news. So do you think that the professional media should get some special treatment on online platforms and social media? And I'm asking because this is one of the big discussions at the EU level, again now in the context of the Media Freedom Act. It was previously in the Digital Services Act, in the AV Audiovisual Media Services Directive. There is this debate on we should get privileges or a privileged treatment on social media, and that professional content is not so quickly filtered out, or that they are somehow being pushed by the recommender algorithms. What's your view on that? Do you think that in order to continue fulfilling your public role as reporter, do you need that help?
There are a few new outlets in Flemish, for instance. You have Apache. It's a semi-professional news outlet who's doing a very good job. And then you have Doorbraak, who's more Flemish nationalistic inspired, but they have also some interesting interviews that they're publishing. I don't ask for a special status for the professional media, because they have to earn it. They have to earn it. They don't have to be given it. We have to earn it. If we want that special protection, if we want that label of so-called quality press, we have to earn it. And sometimes we see that the semi-professional or even the amateurs are better at it than what we're producing. There are some, for instance, Axel will know it because he's been working in Europe. There are some news outlets in Europe, on Europe, that are far better informed and that are made by senior professional journalists who are far better informed on Europe than what we can read in for instance, the Flemish newspapers. Europe is a underreported story. But you have news outlets who are very, very good at it. For instance, there's a website called Social Europe on social issues. I mean, there are top quality academics. You were talking about the university, who are publishing them. I mean, I'm an avid reader of all these of the news outlets. So they earn their good reputation.
Yeah. I agree with Rik, and to answer your first questions, yes, we do have, I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence, but I know that we have a cell in our newsroom, fact-checking cell, recently, only a few years now, and they are using...
Nog één vraag. Doet er ook een stuk of 3. De liefste fellows en Stefan.
Ja, oké. Ja.
But where I'm a bit worried is that when the authorities say that they are going to fact check, I mean, even NATO wants to intervene in the information that we're getting. Well, Europe also wants it. If the authorities are taking up that job,
you have to be suspicious.
I'm a bit suspicious.
Yep.
You have a question? Yeah, I guess that's, we always just have other drinks too. So something I want to bring up here is well, kind of tying into AI and as well these platforms. You know, when you brought up like Murdoch and how fortunately these companies aren't like Murdoch. You know, Rupert Murdoch comes out of a particular cultural context. He comes out of this neoliberal wave, especially out of Australia, US, UK. And if you look at these platforms, they're reproducing, sometimes even taking over public spaces, but they themselves are being created by people in a particular context, in Silicon Valley, for profit, replacing areas that are not for profit. And then, so everything you're putting out is always being filtered through effectively a very capitalist US lens. And it's perhaps I could say silencing your own very upright approaches to media. So I guess like my question around this is, what do you think about the impact of these cultural contexts that the platforms have created, especially them pushing forward this idea that technology is one way universal? Do you think that there's another way that, say, Belgium could approach this technology or influence these things to be able to have a Belgian approach to getting the news out?
Just something apart from what he's saying about Murdoch. Murdoch is also has serious news outlets. I mean, Wall Street Journal is his property. The Times in London is owned by him, and he has all these other news. But there's a delicate point there. Is if you don't, Belgium isn't an island. I mean, when I started as a reporter for NAC magazine, our main competitors were the weekend newspapers in Flanders, that were the other magazines like Humo. My successor, he's competing with international outlets. I mean, these youngsters studying here in Leuven, I mean, on their websites, they're checking out Der Spiegel, they're checking out The Economist, if they're doing their job well. So in fact, you're right, the competition is international. And you feel it in an issue, in a news item like for instance, the Ukraine, what's happening in the Ukraine. And it's very difficult sometimes, in fact, you're right, to push back some of the information, the wrongful information that has been spread. It's a daily combat.
Someone else?
All right, so I have one question. And I think in the very beginning, you mentioned about the role of public media and it's funded by the government and taxpayer. If you look at last 4 or 5 years, even earlier, with the growth of Facebook, Twitter, and XYZ, my feeling is that, and you can tell me right or wrong, the demand for the public media has gone down. That is, people are just not going to those websites, those television shows. In that case, when the demand has become so less, how do you justify the government to pay the tax-funded money to be able to create something which doesn't really have demand?
Referring to in the beginning of what I was saying, I think. And let's take the example of the United States, NPR. I don't know what the market share of NPR is. It's perhaps less than 5%. But it doesn't mean the reach of NPR can be still quite important.
I just comment on that. NPR used to be government funded and has basically moved out almost exclusively. It's funded by the people who are listening.
I was going to say that. It's funded by the people. So that's the extreme I was going to refer to. If you don't accept public funding for public broadcasters, because you're saying, well, the demand is decreasing.
I'm not saying whether I accept or not. I'm just saying that how do you economically justify the taxpayer money going into some platform which doesn't have much demand?
But you know, that's really the pressure that public broadcasters will feel, because at the same time, when a public broadcaster, we've seen it happening, and I'm sure Rik will confirm it, we've seen it happening during the 90s also when VTM was coming up, and VRT, public broadcaster, was losing rapidly a big market share. Then politicians were saying, well, we're saying what you are saying actually, well, I'm not saying what you are saying. They were saying, why should we keep funding a public broadcaster that's losing so much market share? And VRT should keep up or should maintain its market share for us to keep funding it. So if VRT is doing it, well, public broadcasters in general are performing too well, they have a problem, because then they are blocking the success of the commercial media. If they are doing too badly, then people will start saying, why are we funding them? And that's really a big problem. And I think in Flanders, in Belgium in general, we have reached more or less a kind of balanced view now. People accept that there is still room for public media, they have a role to play. I can even say that without strong public media in a small cultural space like Flanders, also commercial media would not be encouraged to aim for a certain quality like they are doing now. If I'm saying that VTM is maintaining a very high quality for a commercial newsroom, it's because of the competition of VRT. I'm quite sure about that, and I think...
Yeah, can imagine.
And I'm just going to take an economist's hat, and they say that I'm the taxpayer funding XYZ.
No, but if I can't...
If you have to look at the model for these public broadcasters.
The BBC.
The BBC has been the model for all these public broadcasts at the time, and the main issue was maintaining the standard of reporting. I mean, to keep up a certain standard of reporting. And you see a strange thing, because at the time in Russia, when they were talking about public broadcasting in Russia, I mean, that was the least believable broadcasting. But here, what you see is when something happens, like for instance the attacks on Zaventem, you see even people who are used to look at VTM suddenly returning to the public broadcast. Even it was an interesting case also in the French-speaking part of the country. The first television station in the French-speaking part of the country is not RTBF, it's TF1, the French television.
France.
The very French. I mean, there was once elected a Front National man in Bologna without any campaign, because they were all believing that he was on the French list. And the second one is RTL, commercial, and then you have the RTBF. Until a big drama happens.
Like COVID, for instance?
Suddenly you see people are moving immediately to the public broadcast. And luckily we have, I'm not saying that because he's here, but we have quite a high standard of reporting on television and radio. Although I think that from time to time they're giving in to too much infotainment, but they are on the level of what they're supposed to be.
Okay, I want to level that. But the way I think about this, if you look at the US, there are two journals, New York Times and Wall Street Journal. They are all considered pretty high quality if you define however you want. They have a completely different perspective. One will say A, one will say B. The reporting is high quality, whatever you want to call it. You may disagree or agree, but what I'm saying is that when you leave it to the private market emerges to satisfy the demand of people.
You have no idea what the MIT would look like without NPR. You're missing the point that having something else that's theoretical is worth taxpayer money, even if not every taxpayer watches it. Just like not every taxpayer goes to the universities that are
Compared to...
We will continue this debate later on.
It's a debate apart.
Do you want to have a last note?
Well, maybe to connect to the AI question, because what you were suggesting to give this like fast track to the traditional and professional media is maybe not a good idea, but could it even go that AI can tell the difference between the truthful and the non-truthful, and should that happen? And should that be regulated, that in one way or another, the same algorithms that now push forward all the fake things and put the people in the rabbit holes, that the same algorithms can be used to push up the truthful news?
The correct reporting, even if it is for a news outlet like the Apache or NAC, it's if you lose the confidence of your news consumer, you're dead. And it will happen to all those people who are having these news outlets who are spilling out these non-stories. In the end, they're losing. It takes a while, but they're losing.
Let's hope so, I would say.
No, I'm sure that they will lose. It is a nice story, for instance, everybody remembers, or some remember, the Joe McCarthy hysteria in America. The main press was supporting Joe McCarthy. From the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times, they were all supporting the hunt for communists by Joe McCarthy. Until one guy did his job, Ed Murrow, at CBS, against his bosses. He didn't want him to do that, but he did it. And he unmasked the Joe McCarthy, and that was the end of the hysteria. So, in the end, truth prevails.
So okay. This was a difficult Thank you very much for the panel. So now, reflection.